Hey guys, tonight we step into the soft, candlelit hush of an old map room where paper smells faintly like dust and dried glue, and the edges of the world curl upward like sleepy leaves. You're leaning over an atlas so wide it feels like a tabletop ocean, and in the dim amber light, you see a word that looks both familiar and strange, like it's been waiting for you to notice it: Tartary. You're not here to prove anything, because historians debate evidence varies, and a lot of what people say online is more vibe than verifiable. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some are calm, what-if imagination. And yes, you probably won't survive this emotionally if you expect the past to behave like a neat spreadsheet. Because history is basically a cat. It knocks your tidy theories off the table and then stares at you like you're the problem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we settle in, tell me your location and your local time down in the comments. I love picturing this story drifting across the different bedrooms and night shifts and early mornings like a slow radio signal. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep your fingers on the edge of the atlas as if it might slide away, and you let the room go quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing. The map is old, not ancient, but old in that particular way. Paper gets old, slightly yellowed, a little crackly, stubbornly alive. The ink lines are confident in places and hesitant in others. Like whoever drew them sometimes had to guess where certainty ended and rumor began. Most historians agree that when you see Tartary or Tartaria on early modern European maps, you're often looking at a broad label for a vast region, not necessarily a single unified empire with one capital and one crown. The word can feel like it's pointing to something enormous and coherent, but what's broadly accepted is that map labels in those centuries were often shorthand. They were a way to say, this is the zone beyond our familiarity, the wide sweep of lands where languages, powers, and peoples change across long distances. And still you understand why the word grabs people. Tartary is written large on some maps sprawled across the top half of Asia like a blanket. It's dramatic, it's cinematic. It looks like the kind of thing that should come with a trumpet fanfare and a title card. One interpretation is that this visual impact is part of the story's power. A name printed across a huge space can trick the eye into imagining a single political unit, even if the reality on the ground was more complicated. Another interpretation, slightly more cautious, is that the cartographer is simply doing what cartographers often did, turning messy, shifting realities into something you can fold and carry. You trace the letters with one finger slowly, like you're reading Braille. The paper is rough. The ink has a tiny raised texture that makes you feel for a second like the past is physical and present. And your brain does what brains do in low light. It starts connecting dots. What if you wonder? The story is pointing at something else, not an all-powerful empire hiding in plain sight, not a secret civilization with laser beams and impossible machines, but something subtler. What if the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm? What if Tartaria is a doorway into how knowledge used to travel, slow, filtered, translated, misunderstood, and then frozen into ink? Let's stay on solid ground first. Most historians agree that early modern European mapmakers relied on a mix of sources: travelers' accounts, diplomatic reports, merchants' stories, missionaries' letters, and earlier maps. Archaeology suggests that the Eurasian landmass was never some blank space waiting for Europeans to label it. It was full of cities, Trade routes, fortresses, farms, nomadic camps, sacred sites, and political systems that made sense to the people living there, even when outsiders struggled to understand them. But the European map's job was not to reflect every nuance. It was to create a usable picture for European audiences, often with European concerns in mind. So, labels like Tartary could serve as a catch-all for regions associated in European imagination, with the Tatars and the Mongols and the wider steppe world. The label had a gravity to it, a kind of shorthand awe. And here comes the line you need to hear at least once tonight, like a gentle bell in the dark. Historians still argue whether Tartary on these maps should be treated as a geographic label, an ethnographic label, or a political label that sometimes hints at specific powers in specific moments. It's not always the same thing, and it doesn't always mean what modern readers want it to mean. You lean back a little and let your eyes adjust. In the map room, there's a faint smell of wax and wood polish. Somewhere a building settles with a tiny creak, as if the structure itself is stretching in its sleep. You look down again, and you notice other names, too. Names that feel familiar because you've heard them in school. Or documentaries, China Muscovy, Persia. Those labels feel real because they fit into stories you already know. But Tartary feels different. It feels like a gap in your mental bookshelf. And that's where theories love to grow, in the spaces between the books. A popular rumor claims that Tartaria was the greatest empire erased from human history, a globe-spanning superpower scrubbed from records, leaving only scattered ruins and inconvenient maps behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers a satisfying shape, a rise, a fall, and a deliberate cover-up. And humans as a species adore a dramatic arc. We'll take a messy truth and beg it to put on a cape. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask useful questions. Why did Tartary appear so often on maps? Why did the term fade? Why do people today feel like something was hidden? One mainstream safe answer is simple names change. Political entities reorganize. Empires expand and contract. And as European knowledge of Asia grew more detailed, map labels became more specific. What was once Tartary might become a patchwork of labeled regions and polities. Siberia, Manchuria, Mongolia, Central Asian Khanates, and more precise borders shaped by treaties and exploration. Another careful reading might suggest that Tartary functioned like a broad umbrella term, the way people sometimes use a big regional label when they don't know the local names. It's possible that later cartography replaced the umbrella with smaller labels as European contact increased. That's suggestive, not conclusive, but it's a grounded way to understand the shift without needing a secret eraser behind the curtain. You turn a page in the atlas. It makes a soft, dry whisper, like a broom brushing dust. The next map is slightly different, maybe from a different publisher or a different decade. And again, you see variations, Great Tartary Independent, Tartary Chinese, Tartary, sometimes with dotted boundaries that look almost apologetic. This is where the map itself becomes part of the story. Maps are not just mirrors. They're arguments. They're marketing. They're snapshots of what someone believed or wanted you to believe at a particular moment with a particular audience in mind. Most historians agree that early modern maps often mixed confirmed geographic features with speculative ones. Some coastlines were guessed. Some mountains were drawn because people assumed mountains should be there. Rivers sometimes took convenient paths. Empty spaces were filled with decorative flourishes, sea monsters, caravans, tiny drawings of camels that look like they're having a bad day, And that's your first light joke of the night, because yes, even in serious history, there's always a camel who looks like it just remembered. It left the stove on. You keep scanning, and you notice something else. The word Tartary is sometimes positioned in a way that makes it feel like a single entity, but then you see smaller labels within it, sometimes hinting at specific groups or regions. This supports the idea that the term is flexible, and that flexibility is a clue. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The presence of Tartary on a map might support the idea that Europeans recognized a broad zone of steppe and northern Asian lands associated with certain peoples and powers, but it does not automatically support the idea that there was one unified Tartarian empire spanning the whole area at the same time. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and to be clear, this is debated, and now you start to feel the true hook of the evening. Because the question isn't just, was Tartaria real? The question is, what did people mean by that word, and why does its meaning feel slippery? You imagine yourself stepping off the paper map and into the landscape it implies. The candlelight becomes moonlight. The room's quiet becomes open air. You're standing on the edge of a wide, cold plain where grass moves in low waves like a sleeping animal breathing. Far away, the silhouette of a caravan drifts along the horizon. You can't hear voices yet, just the wind and the faint clink of something metal like a buckle or a pot. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, what's broadly accepted is that Eurasia was crisscrossed by routes of trade and exchange for centuries. Goods moved, people moved, stories moved, even ideas moved, and ideas are the sneakiest travelers because they don't need horses. Archaeology suggests long-distance trade and cultural contact in many periods, and the evidence we do have points to regions that were interconnected even when they were politically divided. But the map labeled Tartary doesn't tell you the story of those connections. It tells you how someone else tried to summarize them. Now you might be thinking, okay, but if Tartary was just a label, why do some people claim it was erased? Here's a mainstream safe place to pause. Historical memory is fragile. Records get lost in fires, floods, wars, and neglect. Archives rot, paper tears, ink fades, and sometimes governments do reshape narratives emphasizing certain histories and minimizing others. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how nation building often works. One interpretation is that the fading of Tartary from maps could feel like erasure because the term disappears quickly in the timeline of printed media, replaced by other words that don't carry the same dramatic weight. If you're attached to the old label, its disappearance can feel suspicious, even if the change has mundane explanations. A fringe idea proposes that this change was deliberate, a coordinated effort to hide a grand civilization. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for this claim, the evidence is usually thin, often relying on interpretive leaps, unusual readings of architecture, or assumptions that old maps must represent political reality in a straightforward way. Still, you don't have to mock the question to examine it. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You turn one more page and you see something that makes you sit a little straighter. It's not proof of anything, it's just a feeling. But the feeling matters because it shows you why the story catches. The map's typography makes Tartary look important. The label is big, the space is huge, and your brain, half asleep, already thinks big name, big space, big empire. It's such an easy leap, so tempting you can feel it in your fingertips. Historians still argue whether our modern habit of thinking in neat nation-states makes us misread older terms like Tartary, projecting our expectations onto a past that didn't organize itself the same way. And if you're being honest, you know you do this all the time. You see a label, and your mind wants a flag, an anthem, a capital city, and a dramatic movie trailer voice. But history is often more like weather. Patterns, pressures, fronts moving and shifting. Power rises in one place, thins in another, and sometimes changes shape without disappearing. You close your eyes for a second and listen to the fan hum. The hum becomes a motif in your mind, like the steady sound of a distant wheel turning. When you open your eyes again, you decide you won't rush. You'll move with the map, slowly, patiently. Because tonight isn't about being certain, it's about learning how to walk through uncertainty without getting lost. And as your finger rests again on that old printed word, you let the question hover in the air, like breath in cold night. What if the story is pointing at something else? Your fingertip stays on the page a moment longer, as if the ink might warm up and start explaining itself. But it stays politely silent, like a librarian who refuses to gossip. So you do what humans always do when a thing refuses to speak clearly. You look around it. You look at what else is on the page. You look at the habits of the person who drew it. Most historians agree that early modern map-making is as much about worldview as it is about geography. A map is never just a picture of land. It is a translation of imperfect information into confident lines, and it usually comes with invisible instructions. Trust this border, ignore that, blank space, assume. This name means something stable. Archaeology suggests that the people living across Eurasia did not experience their world as one big labeled region. They experienced it as home, as pasture, as river crossing, as city gate, as winter road, as a string of familiar places that do not need a European title to feel real. You tilt the atlas toward the candle and you notice the fine print. Sometimes there is a cartouche, a decorative frame with ornate swirls, like the map is wearing a fancy collar. Sometimes there is a dedication to a king or a patron, because even old maps need sponsors. And right there, you feel the first gentle reality check of the night the cartographer is also a business person. They are selling certainty. They are selling usefulness. They are not selling a philosophy seminar about uncertainty, which is tragic, because honestly, that would be my favorite seminar, and you would probably fall asleep in the front row in a good way. What is broadly accepted is that many European map makers copy from each other. They borrow coastlines. They borrow place names. They borrow spelling. They borrow entire sections, the way you borrow a neighbor's recipe, and then claim it is a family tradition. So when you see Tartary repeated across maps, one interpretation is that you are watching a label propagate through publishing networks, not necessarily watching an empire stand up and wave at you. You shift your gaze to the margins. There might be notes about the peoples of the region, sometimes written with confidence, and sometimes with that vague tone that says, "I heard this from a guy who heard it from a guy." You remember that travel accounts were often filtered through translation and bias. A visitor might spend a few weeks near a trade post and come home describing an entire continent. It is possible that the map is not lying so much as it is compressing reality into something portable. Historians still argue whether old map labels like Tartary should be read as political statements, ethnographic categories, or simple convenience words for distant regions that Europeans did not fully understand. And if you have ever tried to label a box of mixed cables in a drawer, you already understand the impulse. You do not label each cable. You write cables and hope for the best. That is not a conspiracy. That is fatigue. That is a person trying to get through the day. You turn to another page and see a different style. The rivers bend more sharply. The mountain ranges are drawn like little spines evenly spaced, as if the earth is a friendly dragon taking a nap. The coastlines look more confident in some areas than others. Most historians agree that by the 1600s and 1700s, European mapping improves in many regions through exploration trade and state projects, but it remains uneven. Some areas are charted carefully, others stay generalized. And generalized spaces are where big labels love to live. One interpretation is that Tartary functions like a placeholder for the unknown, not empty, not uninhabited, but unknown to the map's intended audience. It is a category that says here, be complexity. It also says we are not sure how to subdivide this yet. That is a normal stage in how external knowledge evolves. The evidence we do have points to a gradual shift as European powers gain more detailed information through contact diplomacy, conflict, and scholarship, and as states like Russia and Qing China expand and administer borderlands in ways that become more legible to European observers. You pause on that last thought because it is important. On the ground, real administrations exist. Real polities exist. Real borders shift through treaties, war, and negotiation. But the map on your lap might be behind the curve, or ahead of it, or simply uninterested in the details that matter to the people living there. A more cautious explanation could be that maps sometimes show what publishers think their buyers expect, which may be older knowledge presented in a polished new edition. Now your mind wanders to the modern claim, again the big one with the dramatic music, the greatest empire erased. A fringe idea proposes that the persistence of Tartary on maps is evidence of a single coherent civilization with advanced infrastructure that later gets scrubbed from records. This theory is not widely accepted, but you can see why it feels persuasive because it offers a clean narrative. It turns confusion into a plot. It turns messy geography into a villain and a victim. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can test it gently. If there were a globe-spanning empire, you would expect consistent administrative evidence across regions, official documents, coins, standardized legal systems, consistent state architecture, and clear continuity in local records. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and what we can't confirm here is the single unified structure. The evidence is scattered and varied because Eurasia is genuinely diverse, and historical states in these areas are many layered and changing. You notice the map's decorative drawings again. Sometimes there are little scenes of riders or tents. Sometimes there are animals placed like stickers. Here is your quirky tidbit gently placed on the pillow. Some European maps and engravings depict the peoples of Tartary with exoticized illustrations that blend observation with stereotype. And those images can mislead modern eyes into thinking they are official portraits of a single culture. One interpretation is that these drawings are more about European imagination than Asian reality, a kind of visual shorthand that says distant, nomadic, unfamiliar without doing the hard work of specificity. You tap the paper lightly as if scolding it. The paper does not apologize. Paper never does. It just sits there smug and flammable. Your second light joke arrives quietly. You realize you have been treating the map like a witness in a courtroom. But it is more like a gossip columnist who sometimes gets the year wrong and still expects you to clap. You breathe in and smell the wax again. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground map makers compile. Labels spread. Knowledge shifts. Names change. Mist the feeling that a vanished word must mean a vanished empire. And still the what-if mood lingers, soft and tempting. What if the story is pointing at something else, not a hidden empire, but the way information itself gets flattened? The way complex regions become single words. The way your modern mind, trained on nation-states and borders, wants to upgrade a label into a flag. You sit with that thought long enough to let it settle like dust in a sunbeam. Then you turn the page again, ready to look beyond the ink and toward the living landscape that ink is trying imperfectly to capture. Your fan hum continues steady and patient, like a reminder that history keeps moving even when the map stays still. And your third light joke slips in as you turn the page. You promise yourself you will never again trust a label that looks too confident, because if a map ever says, obviously, it is probably about to be wrong, you don't lift your eyes from the atlas right away. You let the paper settle after the page turn. You listen to that soft crackle, and you imagine the sound is the step itself. Dry grass underfoot, a quiet hiss as wind combs across it. The map can only show you lines and labels, but your mind insists on giving those lines a temperature, a smell, and a horizon that seems to go on forever. Most historians agree that the Eurasian steppe is not one place so much as a vast corridor stretching across thousands of miles, connecting regions that modern people like to separate into neat boxes. What's broadly accepted is that this corridor has long supported movement of herders and their animals, of armies, of traders, of messengers of ideas. Archaeology suggests that along these routes, you don't just get wandering, you get exchange goods, traded techniques, shared stories swapped like small, precious coins. One interpretation is that when European mapmakers wrote Tartary, they were pointing clumsily, broadly at this immense connective tissue of Eurasia. Not a single empire as a fixed object, but a zone where different powers rise and overlap, where alliances and rivalries shift with seasons and leaders, where a border can feel less like a wall and more like a gradient. Historians still argue whether the steppe should be understood primarily as a barrier separating settled civilizations or as a bridge that links them, because the answer changes depending on the century you stand in. You can almost feel your own mental map reshaping as you take that in. You were taught to imagine civilization in clusters of cities, but the steppe reminds you that mobility can also be a form of organization, and that distance can be managed without stone walls. You slide your hand across the atlas and stop where rivers are drawn like veins. The Volga, the Ob, the Irtysh. Names that show up often because rivers are the original highways. Most historians agree that river systems across northern Eurasia enabled trade migration and state formation in ways that are still being studied. The evidence we do have points to communities that use these waterways for movement and connection, and those connections matter because they're the opposite of erased. They leave traces, artifacts, settlement patterns, burial traditions, language shifts, and sometimes, when you're lucky, written records. You imagine yourself stepping into the landscape for real. You're not in a palace. You're not in a marble hall. You're on a plain where the sky feels bigger than your plans. The air is cold enough to make your nostrils sting. You can taste dryness. In the distance, a line of riders moves slowly, their silhouettes bobbing like punctuation marks in a sentence written across the horizon. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground first. What's broadly accepted is that steppe societies developed sophisticated ways to move, coordinate, and survive in environments where settled agriculture is harder. You're dealing with seasonal pastures, herds that need grazing weather, that can punish mistakes. It's possible that the empire feeling people get from Tartaria stories comes from misunderstanding how power can look different here. A kingdom isn't always a fixed capital with stone walls. Sometimes it's a network, a confederation, a set of obligations, a leader's charisma reinforced by logistical skill. One interpretation is that outsiders used to judging power by architecture misread mobility as emptiness. And that brings you to the really practical thing you can almost hear in the fan hum logistics. Most historians agree that when steppe empires or confederations did form like the Mongol Empire, which we'll handle carefully, they succeeded not by magic, but by systems, communication, discipline, horse culture, and adaptive administration. Archaeology suggests the movement of people and goods across Eurasia accelerated during certain periods, and the evidence we do have points to routes that become more integrated under strong political umbrellas. But here is the careful line you keep repeating to yourself like a lullaby. A region that supports empires at different times is not the same as a single permanent empire for all time. A popular rumor claims that Tartaria was one continuous civilization that ruled everything and later got deleted. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it latches on to a real feeling that something big happened across this corridor and that modern education can be simplified. And yes, that is a real thing. School lessons can flatten complex histories into a few memorable names, leaving vast areas feeling like blank space. Blank space feels suspicious. Blank space feels like somebody did it on purpose. A more cautious explanation could be that the blank space is an artifact of curriculum translation and perspective, not an intentional global erasure. Now let's touch the big name that often floats behind Tartary, like thunder behind distant clouds. Most historians agree that the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries was historically enormous and reshaped Eurasian politics and trade. The evidence we do have points to real administrative practices, diplomatic exchanges, and networks that connected far-flung regions. Archaeology suggests that trade and travel became more feasible across certain routes under Mongol rule in some periods, though the experience varied by place and time. Historians still argue whether the so-called Pax Mongolica is best understood as a genuine era of stability across Eurasia or as a patchwork of routes that were safer in some stretches and still risky in others. Even the comforting phrase peace needs footnotes, and footnotes are basically history's way of saying, please don't oversimplify me. You smile slightly at that thought, because it feels like the map itself is speaking now in a tired voice. Please. No oversimplifying. Here comes your quirky tidbit for the night, set down gently like a small object on a bedside table. European sources sometimes use Tartar in ways that blurred different peoples together, and the word even picked up strange associations in European imagination, some of them shaped by fear and myth, more than careful ethnography. One interpretation is that the very sound of Tartar helped Europeans build a mental category for the far horse world, which then got printed on maps as Tartary. It's not a conspiracy, it's a reminder that language carries emotion, and emotion can sneak into cartography. You pause, letting your eyes drift over the huge printed region again. Great Tartary. The word great is doing a lot of work. It sounds official. It sounds like a title. It also sounds like marketing, like the map maker is saying, this is big buy, this map, impress your friends. Your first light joke arrives with a yawn. You realize Great Tartary sounds like a restaurant. You would absolutely try once just to see what they serve. And then you'd spend the rest of the night telling everyone. The portions were enormous, but the borders were unclear. You turn the atlas slightly and look for the smaller labels again. Sometimes you see references to specific regions, Siberia, for example, or areas tied to known polities. You realize that the big label sits over many possible realities. If we treat the greatest empire claim as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can ask, where are the uniform administrative traces? Where are the consistent state documents across all these different landscapes? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what you can't confirm is a single, continuous, unified structure that matches the scale implied by some modern Tartaria stories. That doesn't mean there's nothing interesting here. It means the interesting part might be how Europeans grouped the unfamiliar and how later readers misread the grouping as a missing empire. You imagine yourself on a trade road now, not a modern highway, but a path worn into the earth by repetition. You hear leather creak. You smell smoke. You pass a cluster of tents, then miles later, a wooden settlement near a river, then later still a fortified town where a gatekeeper squints at you. The landscape is not empty. It is layered. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and the solid ground keeps telling you the same sleepy truth. Eurasia is huge in history. There is not one story, but many stories braided together. The word Tartary on a map is a braid seen from far away. Up close, it is threads. As the fan hum steadies you, let the threads slide through your mind without trying to knot them into a single, tidy bow. You're not here to force the past to confess. You're here to watch the shape of the question change as you walk through it. And when you close the atlas, just for a moment, resting your palm on the cover, you can almost feel the vibration of all those roads, all those hoofbeats, all those river currents moving beneath a single printed word. You open the atlas again, and it feels like lifting a window in winter. Cold air doesn't rush in, but the image does those long stretches of land, those cautious dotted borders, those names that look confident until you ask them what they mean. Your eyes keep returning to the same set of letters, Tartary, Tartaria, because your brain wants it to be a key. One word, one lock, one secret room. But history, as you're learning, is more like a hallway with many doors, and the labels on those doors have been rewritten by 100 different hands. Most historians agree that the terms Mongol and Tatar have been used in shifting ways across time, and that European writers often blended categories that were distinct in local contexts. What's broadly accepted is that the Mongol Empire was a specific political formation with well-documented campaigns and administrations, while Tatar has been applied to various Turkic and other groups, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, and sometimes simply as a foreign label placed on people who did not ask for it. One interpretation is that Tartary grows out of this naming blur. Europeans hear of Tatars. Europeans fear the speed of horse armies. Europeans trade and negotiate and sometimes fight on frontiers. Then Europeans need a big word to put on maps, and the big word becomes a kind of basket. Everything unfamiliar gets tossed into it. If you're reading a map centuries later, you might assume the basket is a single fruit. Historians still argue whether the Western use of Tartar was primarily an ethnonym, meaning a name for a people, or a broader cultural label that expanded and contracted depending on the writer's purpose. It matters because if the word is already fuzzy, then the territory it labels is even fuzzier. And fuzziness is the perfect climate for mystery theories, because fuzziness looks like fog, and fog looks like somebody is hiding something, even when it's just weather. You lower your shoulders and let the fan hum comfort you. You can feel yourself relaxing into the rhythm, solid ground, then mist, then back to solid ground. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the Tartary story is not one story. The evidence we do have points to multiple groups across Eurasia with different languages, cultures, and political histories, sometimes labeled Tatar by outsiders for convenience. Over centuries, these labels become tangled in European writing, and tangled labels can make tangled maps. Here comes your quirky tidbit, gently placed like a curious coin in your palm in some European traditions. The word Tartar was sometimes associated loosely and wrongly with Tartarus, a mythic underworld concept from ancient Greek thought. One interpretation is that this linguistic echo helped feed a spooky aura around the Tartar label in European imagination, even when the real peoples being described were living ordinary human lives with politics, trade, and religion no underworld required. It's the kind of misunderstanding that feels silly now, but it tells you how easily language can become emotional wallpaper. You imagine a European reader in the 1600s leaning over a map by lamplight, feeling a thrill at the edge of the known world. They see Tartary and their mind fills it with riders, caravans, strange customs, and maybe a few monsters for entertainment. Not because they are evil, but because distant places become screens for projection. You realize you're doing a modern version of the same thing. You see Tartaria and your mind wants a vanished empire. Different century, same human habit. Now the big question returns with a softer voice. If Tartary is a catch-all, how do you reconcile it with the very real power of steppe empires? Most historians agree that the Mongol Empire and the successor states and khanates that emerged after it are central to understanding Eurasia. The evidence we do have points to real governance taxation systems and diplomatic networks. Archaeology suggests patterns of movement and exchange that intensified in certain eras. But the successor states are not one unit forever. They diversify, fragment, merge, change. Political history is a slow tide, not a frozen statue. One interpretation is that Tartary on maps sometimes gestures toward those changing political realities without capturing their complexity. A more cautious explanation could be that cartographers used Tartary as a stable label over a region where political authority was not stable in one centralized form, and stability on paper is easier than stability on the ground. Historians still argue whether European cartography of Inner Asia should be treated as primarily geographic knowledge or as geopolitical storytelling designed for European consumers, because mapmakers weren't just drawing. They were persuading you that the world could be known, categorized, owned in the mind. And this is the moment you feel the tug of the modern Tartaria claim again. A fringe idea proposes that because Europeans used a broad label, they must have known of a single great empire. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in this case, the leap from broad label to single hidden empire is usually where the evidence thins out. A label can mean we don't know the subdivisions, not we know there is one unit. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. You stare at the page and notice how the label is sometimes qualified Chinese Tartary, for example, or other regional variations. That tells you something important. It suggests that Tartary is not necessarily a sovereign empire name, but a flexible descriptor that can be attached to different political spheres as European knowledge evolves. Your first light joke slips in as you notice the qualifiers Chinese Tartary sounds like the map is trying to be polite at a party. Like, yes, yes, Tartary, but which Tartary? And the map responds, the one near the snacks. Borders apparently are the original awkward small talk. You let that humor fade back into calm. Then you press forward, because tonight is a slow walk, not a sprint. Most historians agree that Europe's understanding of Asia changed dramatically over time through direct contact diplomatic missions and the growth of state-sponsored exploration. The evidence we do have points to increasing specificity in mapping by the 1700s and 1800s, especially along routes tied to imperial interests. That means labels like Tartary begin to shrink, subdivide, or disappear, replaced by terms Europeans consider more precise. One interpretation is that the disappearance of Tartary from maps is the ordinary result of that process. More detail, more administrative language, more named regions tied to modern state narratives. A more cautious explanation could be that the old umbrella term became outdated as new political realities and new cartographic conventions took over. But what if the story is pointing at something else? Here is the mist offered gently, like a blanket edge you can pull up, but do not have to. What if the erasure people feel is actually a clash between two ways of seeing? The older map sees a fuzzy frontier and labels it with one big word. The modern mind sees nation-states and expects every label to correspond to a stable government. When the label vanishes, it feels like someone removed a government. But the label might never have been a government in the first place. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is a single unified Tartarian political structure that matches the sweeping modern legend. Yet we can confirm something quieter, and in its own way, more haunting names shape memory. If a name disappears from mainstream maps, the regions it once covered can feel like they lost a single narrative thread, even though the threads are still there, just renamed. You take a slow breath and feel your attention settle. The fan hum continues. The candlelight flickers. The atlas remains patient and heavy like a sleepy animal on your lap. And you realize that Tartaria might not be a missing empire. It might be a missing word that once helped Europeans manage their ignorance, which is not as dramatic maybe, but it's also more human. You keep turning pages, not quickly, not with that frantic, I need answers, energy, but with the slower, softer curiosity of someone who stopped trying to win an argument with the past. The atlas is heavy, and each page turn feels like pulling a curtain aside. Beyond the ink, you can almost sense the real-world rivers that don't care what you call them, cities that breathe with or without a label. And people who never once woke up thinking, ah, yes, I live in Tartary time, to be part of a massive mystery. Most historians agree that if you want to understand a big label like Tartary, you have to zoom in until the label breaks apart. What's broadly accepted is that across the regions, often lumped under that word, there were many distinct polities and communities, khanates, kingdoms, city-states, frontier administrations, confederations, and empires that rose and fell. The evidence we do have points to places you can actually point to places with archaeology, architecture, and histories recorded in multiple traditions. So tonight, you do the sleepiest, most practical thing possible. You stop staring at the headline and start looking for street names. You find a portion of the map where rivers meet, where routes converge. You imagine what it takes for a city to exist, their food supply, trade connections, political stability, at least some of the time. Archaeology suggests that urban centers across Central Asia and the broader steppe border zones were vibrant at different periods linked to trade routes, often called Silk Road networks, though that phrase can oversimplify a complex web of paths. Most historians agree that these networks moved not only silk, but horses, spices, metals, ceramics, glass textiles, manuscripts and ideas, religions, technologies, artistic styles. One interpretation is that the Tartaria feeling comes from the fact that these networks make the region feel interconnected, almost like an empire of movement. A more cautious explanation could be that connection is not the same as political unity. It's more like a marketplace of routes where different powers collect tolls, offer protection, or compete for influence. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road should be imagined as a single road, a coherent system, or a loose set of overlapping corridors that shift with climate politics and demand. And yes, even historians argue about the vibe of a road, which is the most academic thing imaginable. You lean closer to the map and picture a real town walls of mud brick, a gate that squeaks a bazaar where languages braid together. You hear the clatter of hooves on packed earth. You smell bread smoke and animal sweat. A kettle whistles somewhere because in every century somebody is making tea and pretending they aren't stressed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you can name real historical polities that existed in or near regions Europeans might label Tartary. You can talk about the Golden Horde as a Mongol successor state that influenced Eastern Europe and the steppe for a period. You can talk about Khanates that emerged later. You can talk about Central Asian states that controlled cities and trade. You can talk about Siberian communities and frontier zones that later come under expanding empires. Most historians agree these entities were real and consequential, even if their borders and internal structures changed over time. One interpretation is that modern Tartaria narratives sometimes flatten these real complicated histories into one mega empire because it's easier to tell one story than 20. A more cautious explanation could be that the sensation of an erased empire is actually a discomfort with complexity. The past doesn't come with one title card. It comes with an ensemble cast. Here comes your quirky tidbit delivered with the gentlest grin. A lot of what Europeans knew about Inner Asia for centuries came through a chain of reporting merchants, repeating what they heard, diplomats summarizing what they understood, translators smoothing unfamiliar terms into familiar ones. One interpretation is that even when the original information was decent, it could warp slightly at each step, like a story told at a campfire that gains a dramatic pause and loses a boring detail. By the time it lands on a printed map, it looks authoritative, even if it's actually secondhand. You tap the map again and feel the irony. You're treating a printed label like scripture, when sometimes it's basically a well-dressed rumor. Your first light joke floats in. You realize you've been trusting the map like it's in GPS voice, but the map is more like a friend who insists they know a shortcut, and then somehow you're all sitting in a parking lot eating fries, pretending this was the plan. Now, the Tartaria claim often tries to pull you toward architecture. Look at these buildings. People say they're too similar, too advanced, too widespread, so there must have been one hidden civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's worth examining carefully because buildings are tangible, and tangible things feel persuasive. Most historians agree that architecture travels. The evidence we do have points to styles spreading through conquest, trade, religious missions, craftsmen moving for work, and elites copying what looks impressive. Archaeology suggests that similarities in building techniques can appear across wide areas without requiring a single centralized empire, especially when materials and engineering constraints lead to similar solutions. One interpretation is that when modern viewers see similar domes, arches, or ornamentation across different places, they assume a single origin. A more cautious explanation could be that they're looking at shared influences, shared technologies, and shared aesthetic fashion cycles. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in many Tartaria-style architectural claims, the leap from similar to single erased empire is where evidence often becomes more suggestive than conclusive. To be clear, this is debated and it's a possibility, not a certainty. Historians still argue whether certain mysterious architectural similarities are best explained by direct cultural diffusion, parallel development, or later restoration and standardization that makes buildings look more uniform than they originally were. In other words, the building you see today may not be the building that existed in 1700, because restoration can smooth out local quirks. You imagine walking through a real city, now the kind that existed at crossroads. You pass through a gate, past a market, into a courtyard. You feel the cool shadow under an archway. You hear a language you don't understand, and you realize the most honest word you could use in this moment is not erased, but unfamiliar. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria is less about a vanished empire and more about the way Western audiences historically struggled to categorize Inner Eurasia, so they used big umbrella names that later faded? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is a single Tartarian identity that everyone shared. But we can confirm that real cities existed, real states existed, and real people lived complex lives under changing rulers. If there's an erasure, one mainstream safe possibility is simply that a broad label covered too much and later specificity broke it apart, leaving modern viewers with a sense that the big thing disappeared. You close your eyes briefly and picture the atlas as a kind of lullaby machine humming with names. Some names stay. Some names change. Some names vanish, not because someone hid them, but because language shifts. Politics shift, and cartography changes its habits. And as the fan hum continues, you let the big label Tartary dissolve into smaller, truer scenes: a river crossing a caravan, a city wall at dusk, a tea kettle, a gatekeeper. Not one empire, many worlds. Your hand rests on the atlas like it's a warm animal, and you can feel your own pulse through the paper. The pages have stopped feeling like a puzzle to solve and started feeling like a landscape to wander. That's a better mindset for tonight, because the biggest Tartaria claim isn't really about one map label. It's about the itch people feel when the world looks too big to fit into the stories they were given. Most historians agree that empire is a slippery word, even in mainstream history. What's broadly accepted is that empires come in many shapes. Centralized bureaucracies with standardized laws, loose confederations that rely on tribute and alliances, maritime empires stitched together by ships, and land empires held by roads, garrisons, and taxes. Archaeology suggests that power can be visible in coins and inscriptions, but also in quieter things: standardized weights, consistent fort layouts, predictable administrative seals, or a stable pattern of resource extraction. One interpretation is that modern Tartaria narratives take the word empire and imagine the most cinematic version of it. One throne, one language, one plan. A more cautious explanation could be that Eurasia, especially across regions labeled Tartary, often shows power as overlapping layers, different authorities in different seasons, local elites negotiating with distant rulers' borderlands that are more like gradients than lines. Historians still argue whether the political formations of Inner Asia are best understood through the lens of states, as modern people define them, or through more flexible models that account for mobility, kinship, networks, and shifting alliances. And if you're thinking, wow, that sounds complicated, yes, that's the point. Complicated is often the most honest version of real. You slide your finger across the map again, then stop and imagine stepping into a real scene. It's night on a wide plain, and the sky is so clear it looks like someone spilled salt across black velvet. A circle of firelight warms your face. You hear low conversation, the soft snort of horses, the clink of metal on leather. Somewhere a kettle is heating, and you realize again that the fan hum in your room and the imagined kettle hiss share the same sleepy rhythm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the map labeled Tartary covers regions where different political entities held power at different times. The evidence we do have points to multiple successor states after the Mongol Empire, multiple khanates, multiple frontier zones, where expanding powers like Russia and Qing China built administration and infrastructure. Most historians agree that these expansions involve treaties, military campaigns, and long-term governance projects that leave paper trails and material traces. One interpretation is that the Great Erased Empire claim is partly fueled by how hard it is for modern audiences to hold multiple timelines at once. You want one story with one name, but the steppe and its bordering regions don't give you that. They give you a moving mosaic. Now, this is where the Tartaria theory often gets specific. It says, if the name was so big on maps, there must have been a coherent state behind it. It also says, if the state disappeared, it must have been erased. This theory isn't widely accepted, but we can still do a calm, practical test. If you have a single coherent empire, you usually expect a consistent administrative signature across its claimed territory, common coinage or a shared monetary system, widespread standardized legal practices, consistent taxation mechanisms, and an identifiable chain of governance. Empires also tend to leave behind a recognizable documentary footprint, decrees, official correspondences, diplomatic records, and internal administrative records, though the survival of those records varies. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is that Tartary corresponds to one unified administrative system spread across all the regions the label covers. That's not an insult to the idea. It's simply keeping solid ground separate from mist. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary is like the West or the Middle East in modern speech, a broad term that can be useful but doesn't automatically imply a single unified empire. One interpretation is that Europeans used Tartary to denote a cultural geographic zone associated with steppe peoples and northern Asian regions, and that this label persisted because it was convenient for outsiders. Here comes your quirky tidbit, gentle as a pillow adjustment. European texts sometimes distinguish Great Tartary from other Tartaries, but the boundaries of these subdivisions often depended on the author's information and purpose. One interpretation is that these sublabels are signs of European attempts to refine categories over time, not evidence of a single hidden state. The subdivisions can be messy and inconsistent, which is exactly what you'd expect from an evolving external understanding. Your first light joke arrives quietly. You realize that if maps could speak, they would say, "I'm doing my best." And if you could speak back, you'd say, "So am I, buddy." It's a tender little moment of solidarity between you and a piece of paper. Now you think about erasure itself. Most historians agree that historical records can be lost and reshaped. Archives burn, libraries decay, wars scatter documents, states rewrite textbooks, names get replaced by new administrative terms. The evidence we do have points to many cases of selective memory and shifting narratives. So, it's possible that some local histories were minimized or misunderstood in later retellings. It's also possible that certain labels fell out of use as new political realities took hold. But a careful reading might suggest that this kind of change is often gradual and bureaucratic rather than dramatic and conspiratorial. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of certain older geographic terms is best explained by improved knowledge and changing cartographic conventions, or by deliberate political reframing by expanding states. The truth can vary by case. In some contexts, states absolutely have incentives to rename and reclassify regions because naming is a form of power. But renaming isn't automatically a global erasure. It's often more like a slow administrative tide. A fringe idea proposes that a coordinated global effort scrubbed Tartaria from records to hide a lost advanced civilization. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in most versions of this claim, the evidence tends to be interpretive, relying on patterns that could have other explanations. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the core fascination with Tartaria is really a longing for a missing chapter? An instinct that mainstream narratives sometimes underteach inner Eurasia compared to Europe's own stories. When people feel a gap, they fill it. Sometimes they fill it with careful research. Sometimes they fill it with a dramatic theory that feels emotionally satisfying. One interpretation is that Tartaria stories are modern myth-making, built on top of real historical complexity. You can hold that without mocking anyone. You can say, yes, the region is fascinating. Yes, map labels are weird. Yes, names shift. Yes, empires rose and fell. And yes, some narratives get simplified. And also, we should be careful not to turn every ambiguity into a single hidden truth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You rest your palm on the atlas again and listen to the fan hum like distant wheels. The map doesn't need to be a secret to be beautiful. The past doesn't need to be a conspiracy to be mysterious. Sometimes it's mysterious because human life is complicated and records are imperfect, and that's enough. And as you prepare to turn the next page, you feel the question soften into something calmer, something more useful. Not, what are they hiding? But what are we missing because of how we label things? The atlas seems to grow heavier the longer you hold it, the way a blanket feels heavier when you're finally ready to sleep. Your eyes slide over the printed land again, but now you're less hypnotized by names and more curious about the physical world behind them. Because this is the part where Tartaria stories usually make their boldest move. They point to buildings. They say, look at the domes, look at the grand facades, look at the ornament, look at how similar it all feels across faraway places. And then they whisper, or sometimes shout, that this similarity must mean one hidden civilization. Most historians agree that architecture is one of the most seductive kinds of evidence because it's tangible. You can see it, you can photograph it, you can stand beneath it and feel small, which is a powerful emotional experience. Archaeology suggests that built environments carry layers of human choice materials, engineering constraints, labor systems, climate needs, religious symbolism, fashion, and politics. The evidence we do have points to architecture as a language that travels, changes accents, and sometimes gets copied with enthusiasm. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories treat architectural similarity as a signature, like a thumbprint. A more cautious explanation could be that similarity is often the result of diffusion imitation shared technologies and later restoration that smooths out differences. Historians still argue whether certain architectural similarities across Eurasia should be attributed mainly to direct cultural transmission, to parallel development under similar constraints, or to the influence of empires and religious institutions that favored recognizable styles. And if that sounds like a lot of options, yes, because history is rarely a single-lane road. You set the atlas down for a moment and imagine yourself leaving the map room. You're walking through a real city, one with stone buildings and winter light. Your breath fogs. The air smells like wet masonry. Somewhere a bell rings, not dramatically, just as a normal part of timekeeping, like your phone buzzing on silent. You look up at a dome. It is beautiful. It is also practical. It sheds snow. It covers space efficiently. It does what domes do. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the evidence we do have points to architectural features spreading widely through known mechanisms. Craftsmen travel, guild knowledge moves, pattern books circulate, rulers import builders, religious traditions build in recognizable forms. Even when you don't have a single empire, you can still have a shared aesthetic ecosystem. Most historians agree that the early modern and modern periods saw extensive movement of people and ideas across Eurasia, especially through imperial expansion trade and diplomatic contact. The evidence we do have points to architecture in many regions becoming influenced by European styles in the 18th and 19th centuries, while European architecture also absorbed influences from elsewhere. It's not always a one-way flow, but power and fashion do tend to steer which styles get copied. Now, the Tartaria claim often highlights mysterious uniformity. It might say, these buildings are too advanced for their time or too consistent, so there must have been a prior hidden civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but let's treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion and walk through it gently. If there was a single erased civilization responsible for a widespread architectural style, you would expect a coherent timeline and clear archaeological continuity, distinctive building techniques, consistent material sourcing, and an unbroken chain of development across regions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm here is that the similarity implies one origin rather than multiple known processes. A more cautious explanation could be that modern eyes sometimes compare buildings from different dates and contexts as if they're contemporaries. A cathedral renovated in the 1800s might look too modern for a medieval foundation. A civic building rebuilt after a fire might carry a different style than the original. A city that standardized facades in a later era can look more uniform than it once was. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. Here comes your quirky tidbit placed with a gentle wink. Many grand buildings you see today are not frozen snapshots of one moment. They're layered like lasagna, except less delicious and more likely to be full of scaffolding. One interpretation is that when people photograph the final polished version, they forget the messy centuries of repairs additions and stylistic updates. If you've ever looked at an old house that got renovated 3 times, you already understand the building is not one story. It's a stack of stories. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine an empire that invented scaffolding and then vanished, leaving behind only ladders and confusion. Honestly, if there's any hidden civilization I'll believe in, it's the one that secretly owns all the missing screws from your furniture assembly. Back to solid ground. Most historians agree that industrialization and modernization in the 18th and 19th centuries changed building techniques dramatically in many regions. The evidence we do have points to new materials, new transportation, and new administrative systems that enabled larger civic projects and more standardized urban planning. Archaeology suggests that cities often rebuild after disasters, sometimes in a more uniform style. Fires, floods, earthquakes, wars. These events can erase older structures and invite new construction. That can create a visual impression of sudden change. Historians still argue whether certain sudden architectural shifts in cities should be attributed mainly to disasters and rebuilding, to state-driven modernization programs, or to economic booms that fund new public works. All of these are mainstream explanations that can produce the kind of reset feeling Tartaria narratives latch onto without requiring a hidden empire. Now, the missed part of the story, offered carefully. A fringe idea proposes that some of these architectural shifts are evidence of a hidden past, a lost era of advanced construction that was covered up. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in most cases, the evidence for this claim tends to be interpretive. It looks too advanced. It's too widespread. The timeline feels off. Those feelings are real, but feelings are not the same as documentation. One interpretation is that the timeline feels off because the modern internet often presents images without context. A building's date can be misunderstood. A restoration can be mistaken for original construction. A style can be misattributed. It's possible that part of the Tartaria mystery is simply the way information is shared fast, visual, decontextualized, and emotionally charged. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria stories are not revealing a hidden empire, but revealing a hidden hunger for context? A desire to slow down, to place buildings back into their timelines, to understand how cities change. In that sense, the theory can be a doorway into real historical curiosity, as long as you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You pick up the atlas again. The paper is cool under your palm. The candle flame wavers slightly. The fan hum continues steady as distant wheels. And you promise yourself a simple rule for the rest of the night. Whenever you see a beautiful building used as proof, you will ask gently, proof of what exactly, and what else could explain it? Because architecture can be mysterious without being magical. And history can be strange without being secret. You keep the atlas open, but your mind is now walking through stone corridors, not paper borders. Buildings are easier to picture than treaties, and that's why this part of the Tartaria conversation is so sticky. A photo of a dome can feel like a revelation. A paragraph about administrative reforms feels like homework. And your sleepy brain, like most sleepy brains, prefers domes. Most historians agree that architectural styles move across borders the way music does. Someone hears a motif, loves it, imitates it, and suddenly it's everywhere with local variations. Archaeology suggests that techniques and materials are often shaped by practical constraints. What stone is available, what timber is plentiful, what climate demands, what labor systems exist, what tools and skills the builders actually have. The evidence we do have points to a world where builders learn from each other. Rulers hire talent from afar, and religious institutions repeat forms because repetition itself carries meaning. One interpretation is that when modern viewers see similar domes or arches in distant places, they assume a single master plan. A more cautious explanation could be that they're seeing the overlapping fingerprints of empire, religion, commerce, and fashion. Historians still argue whether certain iconic architectural forms are best explained as top-down imitation driven by elites, or as bottom-up diffusion through migrating craftsmen and shared craft traditions. And if you've ever watched a trend spread online, you already understand both can happen at once. A powerful patron commissions a building. People admire it. Smaller towns mimic it. Then it becomes traditional, and everyone acts like it was always there. You imagine yourself standing in front of a grand facade with columns. The air is crisp. Snow squeaks under your boots. You look up and feel that familiar human sensation of awe, like your chest has opened a little. It's a real feeling, and it's not foolish, but it can be misdirected. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the evidence we do have points to classical architectural revivals in many places, especially from the 18th century onward. Most historians agree that neoclassical styles spread widely in Europe and later influenced building programs elsewhere, partly because elites associated classical forms with legitimacy, order, and civilization, as they defined it. The columns and symmetry become a political language. A city hall built with classical features is not just a building, it's a statement. One interpretation is that when Tartaria narratives point to these widespread classical-looking buildings and say too similar, they're noticing a real historical phenomenon, standardization, and stylistic imitation. A more cautious explanation could be that the driver is not a hidden empire, but the visible documented forces of modernization, empire, and taste. Here comes your quirky tidbit tucked in like a soft laugh. In many cities, especially in the 1800s, there were pattern books and architectural manuals that spread standardized designs and decorative elements. One interpretation is that this made it easier for builders to reproduce similar facades across regions, especially when local governments wanted a modern look. It's less mysterious than a vanished super-civilization, and more like a very determined aesthetic committee. Your first light joke arrives as you picture that committee. You imagine an official in a frock coat saying, "Yes, yes, very elegant, but could we add more columns?" The citizens simply aren't impressed unless there are at least 12. And the builder sighs, because builders have been sighing since the beginning of time. Now, Tartaria stories often lean into domes, especially onion-shaped domes, and other striking roof lines. They say, why are there domes everywhere, and why do they look related? Most historians agree that domes appear in many architectural traditions because they solve real engineering problems, covering large spaces, distributing weight, creating resonant interiors for sound, and offering a dramatic symbolic shape. Archaeology suggests domes and vaulting techniques evolve and spread through known historical pathways. The evidence we do have points to domes in Byzantine traditions, Islamic architecture, South Asian architecture, and European adaptations, each with their own lineages and local innovations. One interpretation is that similar dome silhouettes can arise from shared influences and practical needs, not from a single origin. A more cautious explanation could be that your eye is grouping shapes that feel similar, even when their construction techniques and histories differ. Historians still argue whether certain shared architectural features are better explained by direct influence from one region to another, or by parallel solutions to similar problems. The answer can vary by case, and it's perfectly normal for scholars to debate influence versus independent innovation. Now for the mist offered gently, without turning it into a claim. A popular rumor claims that these widespread architectural similarities are remnants of Tartaria's hidden infrastructure, later repurposed by new regimes. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has emotional appeal because it turns admiration into revelation. It says, you are not just seeing beauty, you are seeing evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you'd want to ask, where is the continuous chain of dating and documentation showing that these structures predate their commonly accepted construction periods by centuries or millennia? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm generally is a consistent widespread pattern of misdated architecture that would require a single hidden prior civilization across many regions. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that the sensation of misdating often comes from renovations and rebuilds. Cities burn and then rebuild in stone. Earthquakes crack foundations, and then governments reinforce them. A medieval structure gets a 19th century facade. A wooden town becomes a brick town. The visible layer becomes the one people remember. Historians still argue whether certain urban transformations should be seen as sudden breaks or as cumulative changes accelerated by a few key events: fires, reforms, economic booms, state modernization programs. Those mainstream explanations can create the reset feeling without requiring a hidden reset button. You picture yourself walking through a city after a major fire, historically speaking. The air still smells faintly of ash. People clear rubble quietly. Then over years, new buildings rise in a coordinated style because officials want to prevent future fires and project a new identity. It's possible that later generations look back and say, it all appeared at once because they only see the finished result. Your second light joke slides in. You realize that humans love imagining sudden, dramatic changes because slow, bureaucratic reform is the least cinematic thing ever. No one makes a blockbuster titled The Committee on Brick Regulations, and yet brick regulations probably reshaped more cities than secret empires ever did. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria isn't a hidden builder, but a mirror showing you how modern eyes interact with the past? We live in a visual age. We scroll images out of context. We group patterns quickly. We crave a narrative that makes the pattern meaningful. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories thrive because they offer meaning in a world of scattered photos and half-remembered dates. And still, you don't have to throw away the wonder. You can keep the awe. You can keep the chill of standing under a dome. You can keep the feeling that cities have layers. You just don't have to turn awe into certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You look down at the atlas again and notice the ink has not changed. The map stays still. But your understanding moves slowly, like a caravan at dusk. You're learning to see architecture as a conversation across centuries, not a single signature left behind by a vanished empire. And that is its own kind of mystery, one you can actually live with. The atlas is still open, but your brain has wandered into a different kind of room, now the humming workshop of modern myth. Because once the Tartaria theories finish with buildings, they usually reach for technology. They lean in and say quietly, like they're telling you a bedtime secret you're not supposed to repeat, that there was once an advanced civilization with energy systems, machines, and knowledge far beyond its time. And then it vanished, leaving only confusing traces. Most historians agree that the 18th and 19th centuries produced rapid, visible technological change in many regions, and that this period can feel like a leap when you compare it to earlier centuries. What's broadly accepted is that industrialization, new manufacturing systems, improved transportation, and expanding state bureaucracies transformed cities, infrastructure, and daily life. Archaeology suggests that technological shifts often show up in small, boring objects: first bolts, pipes, standardized bricks, machine parts, before they show up as grand monuments. One interpretation is that when you see sudden infrastructure, growth, railways, bridges, uniforms, street grids, big civic buildings, you might feel like something too advanced has appeared too quickly. A more cautious explanation could be that you're seeing the compressed results of long development, plus a burst of investment and organization. Historians still argue whether industrialization should be understood as a sudden revolution or as an acceleration of trends that were already building for generations. And yes, even the Industrial Revolution has an identity crisis, which is honestly relatable. You set the atlas aside and imagine the sound of the fan in your room turning into another sound, the steady chuff of a steam engine, far away muffled by night air. You smell coal smoke. You hear a distant hammer on metal. The rhythm is hypnotic, like the world is building itself in your sleep. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the evidence we do have points to real documented technological development and diffusion. Innovation spread through networks. Inventors correspond, engineers travel states, import expertise, companies invest, workers learn skills. Most historians agree that governments often push infrastructure projects for very practical reasons. Taxation, military logistics, commerce, administration, prestige. If you want to move troops and mail quickly, you build roads and rail. If you want to reduce urban fires, you standardize materials. If you want to show strength, you build big stone buildings that make citizens feel small in a polite civic way. Now, Tartaria narratives sometimes point to odd-seeming details, decorative metalwork, old photographs of mysterious devices, ornate street fixtures, and say these are remnants of a lost energy system. They may suggest free energy hidden power grids or forgotten technology. A fringe idea proposes that the domes and spires on old buildings were not decorative or symbolic, but functional parts of an advanced energy collection system. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it's visually satisfying. You can point at a spire and imagine electricity dancing up it like a fairy tale. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we ask, where is the consistent, testable evidence? Where are the surviving components with clear function? Where are the technical manuals, the industrial supply chains, the maintenance records? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is a coherent, widespread, hidden technological system that would have needed constant upkeep and left behind an unmistakable material footprint. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that many ornate features on buildings, spires, finials, domes, metalwork, have well-known functions and meanings within architectural traditions. They shed water, crown structures, express religious symbolism, or simply display craftsmanship. Decorative elements can look technological when you view them through a modern lens, especially if you're primed to see a secret system. Here comes your quirky tidbit tucked in with a soft smile. The 19th century loved visible technology and ornament at the same time. People put machines on display at exhibitions, built fancy cast iron structures, and celebrated engineering with decoration. One interpretation is that the era's aesthetic ornate plus mechanical can confuse modern viewers into thinking ornament must be a hidden machine. Sometimes it's just ornament. Sometimes it's both a functional structure, dressed up because people like their function to look good. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine a Victorian engineer saying, "Yes, it works, but does it sparkle?" and then adding scroll work to a bridge like it's frosting a cake. Now, there's another reason technology myths latch on to Tartaria: the feeling that modern life is built on forgotten systems you don't understand. Electricity comes out of the wall. Water appears in pipes. Heat arrives from nowhere. You don't see the infrastructure, so it feels magical. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories externalize that feeling. They turn everyday infrastructure into an ancient secret. Most historians agree that the growth of infrastructure often involved state planning, and industrial supply chains that are documented in many contexts. The evidence we do have points to rail lines, telegraph systems, standardized parts, and expanding urban services across the 19th century. Archaeology suggests that these systems leave behind debris fields of their own old insulators, rails foundations, abandoned conduits, industrial slag. Historians still argue whether the experience of modernization was mainly driven by top-down state projects or by bottom-up economic forces and private enterprise. The balance varies by place and time, and sometimes it's both at once, like a tug of war, where everyone insists they're the reason the rope exists. Now, Tartaria stories often claim that something reset society, wiping out an advanced age and replacing it with the modern world. They love sudden transitions. A popular rumor claims that a hidden catastrophe or coordinated cover-up erased the advanced Tartarian civilization, and the new regimes simply inherited the ruins. This theory isn't widely accepted, but again, it has narrative appeal. It's a clean explanation for complexity. It gives you a before and after, a dramatic break. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for claims of a global technological reset tied directly to Tartaria, the evidence is often thin and interpretive, relying on visual impressions, anomalies, and the emotional weight of it seems too fast. A more cautious explanation could be that technological change can feel like a reset when you're viewing it through snapshots. A photograph from 1850 and a photograph from 1900 can look like two different worlds, but the missing 50 years are full of gradual shifts, incremental improvements, and countless people doing boring work, surveying, laying track training workers, expanding factories. The boring work is the true engine of history, which is unfortunate for storytellers and wonderful for nap time. Your second light joke slides in. You realize that if there's any secret society running history, it's not a cabal of shadowy elites. It's the committee of very tired clerks who keep inventing new forms for you to fill out. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria's lost technology is really a modern metaphor for how disconnected we feel from the systems that sustain us? We look back at old cities and see ornate infrastructure, and we project mystery onto it. One interpretation is that the theory's power comes from that projection, not from hard evidence. And still, you don't have to lose the wonder. You can wonder about old engineering. You can marvel at cast iron and brick vaults and early electrification. You can appreciate how fast societies can change when resources, organization, and incentives align. You just keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You pick up the atlas again, and the paper feels cool and steady. The fan hum returns to the foreground. The steam engine sound fades. And you're ready to walk into the next kind of claim, the one that leans less on domes and machines and more on disasters, as if the world itself pressed a reset button. You turn the page again, and the atlas gives you that dry whisper like it's trying not to wake anyone. Your eyes drift over the labels, but your mind is already anticipating the next move in the Tartaria story arc. After maps, after architecture, after lost technology, now comes the big, heavy word that feels like it should have thunder behind it. Reset. Most historians agree that disasters shape cities and records more than most people realize. What's broadly accepted is that fires, floods, earthquakes, epidemics, and wars have repeatedly forced communities to rebuild, sometimes quickly, sometimes over decades. Archaeology suggests that layers of destruction and rebuilding are common in many urban sites. Ash layers rubble, fills, repaired foundations, reused stone, new streets laid atop old ones. the evidence we do have points to a world where before and after happens over and over, not once. One interpretation is that Tartaria narratives borrow that very real pattern, cities rebuilding, and stretch it into a single grand event. A more cautious explanation could be that the reset feeling comes from comparing different layers without recognizing the time between them. Historians still argue whether certain dramatic urban transformations are best explained by singular catastrophic events or by cumulative pressure that finally triggers a large rebuilding campaign. And even when there is a catastrophe, the aftermath is usually not one clean moment. It's years of hauling rubble, arguing about budgets, and deciding whether the new street should be wider, which is a thrilling debate if you're a city planner, and a guaranteed lullaby if you're anyone else. You let the fan hum soften the edges of your thoughts. The sound becomes in your mind rain on a roof. Not a storm, just steady rain, the kind that makes streets shine. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the evidence we do have points to many cities suffering major fires and then rebuilding with new materials and new rules. Most historians agree that in many places, devastating fires led to changes in building codes, less wood, more brick or stone, wider streets, more organized urban planning. Archaeology suggests that fire layers can be very clear in excavations, and rebuilding phases often show new street alignments and standardized facades. This is where a common Tartaria claim steps in. A popular rumor claims that mud floods buried older cities, leaving windows half submerged and streets raised, and that this evidence points to a hidden catastrophe tied to Tartaria's erasure. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is visually persuasive because you can walk through some older cities and see basement-level windows that sit strangely close to the ground. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we ask what else could create the same appearance. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm generally is a single global mud-burying event that would neatly explain basement windows across many regions. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that cities often raise street levels over time for very practical reasons: to improve drainage, to reduce flooding, to build over old debris, to level uneven terrain, or to accommodate new infrastructure. When a street is raised repeatedly, ground floors can become basements, and windows that once looked normal can end up peering out like they're trying to remember what sunlight felt like. Here comes your quirky tidbit placed gently like a pebble you keep in your pocket in many older cities. Building facades and floors change over generations through renovations, expansions, and streetworks. One interpretation is that a sunken window can be the result of urban evolution rather than a sudden burial. It's not as dramatic as a global mud wave, but it's very human. People rebuild, people stack layers, people pave over their own history, and then act surprised when it shows up in the basement. Your first light joke arrives as you picture a city official saying, "We'll just raise the street a little," and then someone repeats that sentence every 50 years until the whole city is basically wearing platform shoes. Most historians agree that floods too can reshape cities. Rivers change course, levees fail, storm surges push water into streets. The evidence we do have points to repeated local flood events in many places, often followed by rebuilding and modifications that raise ground levels. Archaeology suggests flood deposits can be real and measurable, but they are usually local or regional, tied to specific watersheds and circumstances. Historians still argue whether certain historical great floods in specific regions should be understood primarily as natural events, as consequences of land use and engineering choices, or as combinations of both. And yes, even water has politics, which is the most exhausting sentence imaginable, so we'll say it softly and let it drift away. Now, Tartaria stories sometimes combine the mud flood idea with the reset idea that a catastrophe wiped out a global civilization and then new powers moved in and renamed everything. A fringe idea proposes that the reset was coordinated with records altered afterward to hide what came before. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for a coordinated global reset tied directly to Tartaria, the evidence is usually thin and interpretive. It often relies on anomalies, on the emotional power of it feels like something is missing, and on the assumption that widespread rebuilding must have one cause. A more cautious explanation could be that you're seeing many different events, fires here, floods there, rebuilding everywhere, compressed into one story, because one story is easier to remember. Humans love a single cause. It helps us sleep. It's tidy. But the past is rarely tidy. Your second light joke slips in. You realize that if history had a reset button, someone would have pressed it by accident during a meeting and then everyone would blame the intern. That's just how reality works. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reset feeling is pointing at the fact that modern people experience the past in fragments? A photograph of a half-buried window, a map label that vanishes, a grand building with a mysterious basement, a caption with no context. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories flourish because they stitch fragments into a single dramatic quilt. The quilt feels warm. The quilt feels complete. But if you stay on solid ground, you can also stitch fragments into a different quilt, one made of local histories, real disasters, real rebuilding, real administrative renaming, real technological change. It's not as theatrically neat, but it's truer to how humans live. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You glance down at the atlas again. It's quiet. The ink doesn't shout. It just sits there, offering its imperfect snapshot. And you realize the most soothing thought of all, even if there were no single reset, the past still has layers. Cities really do bury their earlier selves under streets and sidewalks, not because they're hiding, but because they're building. You breathe out slowly and let the image form in your mind. A street at night damp from rain shining under lamplight. Beneath it, older stones. Beneath those older dirt. Beneath that, the footprint of someone's home from centuries ago. Not erased, just covered like a sleeping child, tucked under blankets. You keep that image of layered streets in your mind as you return to the other kind of layer, the one people can't photograph as easily: paper, records, filing systems. The quiet, unglamorous machinery of memory that sits behind every confident sentence in a textbook. Because once Tartaria theories finish with maps, buildings, and disasters, they often settle into their coziest accusation. The archives were altered, the libraries were scrubbed, the story was cleaned up until Tartary vanished like a footprint in snow. Most historians agree that archives are fragile in ways most people don't like to think about. What's broadly accepted is that documents are lost constantly for boring reasons, and dramatic ones: fires, floods, wars, insects, mold, negligence, political upheaval, and simple decay. Archaeology suggests that even when physical artifacts survive, the written explanations often don't. And the evidence we do have points to historical reconstruction as a careful, sometimes frustrating puzzle assembled from partial pieces. One interpretation is that the gap between what happened and what survives can feel like someone is hiding something. A more cautious explanation could be that the past is just messy. Paper is not eternal. Ink is not immortal. Bureaucrats, bless them, are not always good at disaster preparedness. You imagine a library in winter. Not the romantic kind with secret doors and dramatic thunder. The normal kind. Wooden shelves, a faint smell of leather bindings and dust. A clerk at a desk rubbing tired eyes, stamping a document, stacking it, and thinking about dinner. This is the daily life of memory, 1,000 small acts of sorting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, most historians agree that states and institutions curate records. They decide what to preserve, what to copy, what to classify, and what to prioritize. The evidence we do have points to many examples where political changes lead to changes in record keeping. New regimes rename offices, reorganize archives, rewrite administrative categories, and sometimes downplay inconvenient narratives. This doesn't require a shadowy global plan. It's normal governance. It's also a reminder that history is never just what happened. It's also what got written down and what survived and what was considered worth keeping. Historians still argue whether large-scale shifts in how regions are described in European sources are mainly the result of improved geographic knowledge and changing scholarly conventions, or the result of political reframing by expanding empires that standardized terms and borders. Both forces can be real at the same time, which is inconvenient for anyone who wants one clean explanation. Here comes your quirky tidbit set down softly like a bookmark. Early modern printing and publishing created a kind of echo chamber long before the internet. One interpretation is that once a label like Tartary became common in maps and encyclopedias, it kept appearing partly because it was already familiar and safe for publishers. Then, when newer terms became fashionable and more accurate in the eyes of European scholars, the older umbrella term could fade rapidly, not because it was erased, but because it stopped selling clarity. Your first light joke slides in as you picture a publisher in a powdered wig saying, "We're rebranding," which is hilarious because you realize humans have been rebranding geography for centuries, and somehow your brain still reacts like, wait, they changed the label conspiracy. Now we step into the mist carefully, because this is where theories get emotionally sharp. A popular rumor claims that there was a deliberate, coordinated effort to remove Tartaria from history books and archives, scrubbing evidence of a mighty empire and replacing it with new narratives. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to a real human instinct when something feels missing. You imagine a hand that removed it. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask gentle, practical questions. What would coordinated erasure require? It would require control across many institutions, languages and regions sustained over time with consistent results. It would also require eliminating not just Western map labels, but local records, oral traditions, material culture, and the administrative signatures of a single vast state. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is a single unified Tartarian archival footprint that gets consistently removed everywhere, leaving only ambiguous traces. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary disappears from many Western sources because Western categorization changes. As European scholarship becomes more specialized, and as imperial administrations in Eurasia become more legible to European observers, the broad umbrella term becomes less useful. It gets replaced by more specific regional names, often tied to contemporary politics and borders. That kind of shift can feel like erasure if you're emotionally attached to the older word. You pause, listening to the fan hum, and you realize how soothing bureaucracy is when you treat it like weather. It doesn't mean you love it. It just means you stop expecting it to be dramatic. Your second light joke arrives like a yawn. You imagine a secret council meeting to erase Tartaria, but instead of cloaks and candles, it's just 12 people arguing about file naming conventions. No Karen, it's not final_final 2. We agreed on final_actual. And honestly, that might be the most realistic conspiracy scene ever. Back on solid ground, most historians agree that one of the biggest distortions in historical memory is perspective. Western sources label vast regions with broad terms. Local sources use different names and categories. Later scholars translate and standardize. In that process, some labels get lost not because anyone is hiding them, but because translation always involves choices. One interpretation is that Tartaria is a victim of translation and categorization. A word that once served as a Western umbrella becomes obsolete as categories refine. A more cautious explanation could be that when modern people encounter older maps, they assume the label must correspond to a single state because modern geopolitics trains you to read maps that way. You look down at your imaginary librarian again, stamping papers. A tiny sound, a tiny act, and yet over centuries, tiny acts decide what becomes official. Now, it's also broadly accepted that political power does sometimes shape public history. Governments commission textbooks, they fund museums, they build monuments, they decide which anniversaries matter. The evidence we do have points to real cases where certain histories are emphasized and others are minimized. So, it's possible that some local stories in regions once labeled Tartary were reframed under later national narratives, especially as borders shifted and empires expanded. That's a mainstream safe possibility, not a dramatic hidden empire conclusion. A fringe idea proposes that the reframing was not just selective emphasis, but a total cover-up of a global civilization. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, the evidence is usually thin, often built from the emotional force of absence, rather than a documented chain of suppression. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if erasure is sometimes the feeling you get when a label changes, and you don't know the replacement story yet? Like looking for a shop you loved, and finding it's still there, but under a new sign with a new interior, and you're standing on the sidewalk thinking, did it disappear, or did I just miss the update? Your third light joke lands softly. You realize history is basically a giant group chat where half the messages got deleted. The usernames keep changing, and someone is always saying, wait, who is Step King 42? And why do they have admin privileges? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You let the atlas sit open again, and you picture the word Tartary fading. Not like a secret being snatched away, but like ink on a sign that's been left in the sun. The place doesn't vanish. The people don't vanish. The routes don't vanish. The label just loses its authority, replaced by newer labels that feel sharper to later eyes. And in that quiet realization, you feel the question settle into a calmer shape. Not a courtroom accusation, but a historian's bedtime whisper. When a word disappears, what else changes with it? You keep thinking about that fading sign, the letters bleaching in the sun. It's such a simple image, and it's so much less dramatic than a cover-up, which is probably why it's also more believable. Names don't just label places. They shape what you notice. They tell you what to group together. They tell you what counts as one thing. And when a name changes, your mental map changes with it, whether you consent or not. Most historians agree that ethnonyms and geographic terms drift over time. What's broadly accepted is that groups are named by themselves, named by neighbors, and named by outsiders, often all at once. And those names don't always match. Archaeology suggests that identities are not fixed objects you can pick up and weigh. They're lived realities that shift with politics, religion, language, and migration. The evidence we do have points to centuries of renaming across Eurasia, some voluntary, some imposed, some accidental, and some simply the result of translation. One interpretation is that Tartary is a Western umbrella term that never fully aligned with how people in the region describe themselves. A more cautious explanation could be that the term is primarily a European category useful for European audiences and therefore vulnerable to replacement when European audiences adopt new categories. Historians still argue whether the Western label Tartar and the mapped Tartary should be treated as reflections of real political groupings at specific moments or primarily as external shorthand that collapses diverse peoples into one name. And that debate matters because if the name is a shorthand, then the story of its disappearance is mostly the story of shorthand changing. You look down at the atlas again. You notice that spelling itself changes from map to map. Tartary, Tartaria. Sometimes you see variants that look like typos. It's a reminder that standardization wasn't always standard. If you've ever tried to spell a foreign place name you heard once in a crowded room, you understand. Your brain grabs the nearest familiar sounds and hopes the world forgives you. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, most historians agree that as the modern era approaches, European scholarship becomes more specialized and political geography becomes more tied to state borders. The evidence we do have points to expanding empires and states publishing more detailed information, surveys, reports, administrative divisions. As that happens, broad umbrella labels can shrink or vanish. One interpretation is that Tartary fades as more specific terms take over, especially as European writers describe Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, Central Asia, and other regions with increasing specificity. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary becomes outdated because it's too blunt to be useful in a world obsessed with precision and bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether the shift toward precise naming in European texts was driven more by genuine knowledge expansion or by political priorities, knowing a region better because you want to trade with it, influence it, or claim it. Both motivations can exist at once. People rarely fund maps purely out of curiosity. Even curiosity usually has a budget line. Here comes your quirky tidbit set down gently like a small, odd key. Many historical terms disappear not because they were wrong, but because they became impolite or unfashionable. One interpretation is that Tartary carried old associations and stereotypes that later writers wanted to avoid as scholarship shifted. Sometimes language changes because people recognize their earlier labels were sloppy. Sometimes it changes because politics demands it. Sometimes it changes because publishers think a new term sells better. History, again, has marketing. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine a fancy academic saying, "We no longer say Tartary, it's Inner Eurasian Macro Region." And you nod politely, even though your soul quietly leaves your body. Now, this is the section where Tartaria stories often make a stronger claim that identity itself was stolen, that peoples were renamed so thoroughly that the memory of a great empire was lost. A fringe idea proposes that mass renaming was used to dissolve a shared Tartarian identity, making it impossible for descendants to trace their past. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it touches a real phenomenon naming can be power. Empires do rename places. States do standardize terms. Colonial administrations do replace indigenous names with their own. Even within empires, capitals rename provinces to make them legible. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can separate two things. One is documented. Many governments have renamed places and peoples. The other is imagined a single unified Tartarian identity erased globally to hide one empire. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is that there was one cohesive Tartarian identity shared across the vast mapped region that later got intentionally dissolved everywhere. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary was never one identity in the first place. It was a label that covered many identities. When it disappears, those identities don't vanish. They become more visible through their own names and histories. In that sense, the disappearance could be seen as a kind of unmasking rather than a deletion, though it might not feel that way to someone who wants the comfort of one big story. Historians still argue whether modern national narratives have simplified the histories of borderlands and steppe regions, emphasizing certain eras and ignoring others. This is a real and important debate, and it's not limited to Eurasia. Every nation tells a story that makes itself the main character. That's just how humans cope with complexity. We choose a protagonist. Your second light joke arrives as you realize you have also been choosing protagonists in your own head. Tartaria is a very charismatic protagonist. It has mystery energy, it has a cape. But the supporting cast, actual peoples and polities across the steppe and its edges are doing most of the real work. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria's erasure is mostly a lesson in how labels can flatten diversity? A name like Tartary can make a whole region feel like one unit to outsiders, and when that name fades, outsiders feel like they lost a unit. But what they lost is not a real empire. They lost their simplification. And losing a simplification can feel like losing a truth, because simplifications are comforting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You picture yourself in a market again, but this time you listen to the names people use for themselves. You hear multiple languages. You watch gestures. You notice clothing styles that make sense for the climate and the work. You see that no one needs the word Tartary to live their life. You turn another page in the atlas, and the big label feels less like a missing empire and more like a historical habit, an old shortcut. And you realize that shortcuts have consequences. They shape what gets remembered. They shape what gets taught. They shape what feels real to later generations. So you let the word Tartary rest in your mind like a soft echo, not a secret, but a reminder. When you change the name of something, you change the story people tell about it. The atlas stays open, but you're not staring at it the same way anymore. Earlier, the label Tartary felt like a silhouette of something enormous. Now, it feels more like a smudge left by a thumb, a sign that someone handled the idea of the region without fully understanding what they were touching. And that brings you to borders, the most deceptively simple lines humans have ever invented. A border on paper looks like certainty. On the ground, it often looks like a river, a forest, a steppe, a mountain, pass, a checkpoint, a tax collector, a marriage alliance, a treaty written in a language you don't speak, and a season that changes everything. Most historians agree that in the modern era, especially from the 1600s through the 1800s, large imperial states expanded and standardized their frontiers. What's broadly accepted is that Russia expanded eastward across Siberia over centuries, building forts, settlements, administrative systems, and trade networks, while the Qing dynasty expanded and consolidated control in various directions, including parts of Inner Asia. The evidence we do have points to treaties, wars, and administrative reforms shaping borders and categories in ways that later become official geography. One interpretation is that as these states expanded, the older Western umbrella term Tartary became less useful because real state borders and administrative names started to dominate European descriptions. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary fades from maps as the world becomes more bureaucratically mapped, less region, beyond, more province, district, frontier line. Historians still argue whether frontier expansion in Eurasia should be understood primarily as military conquest, as colonization, as negotiated incorporation, or as some shifting mix of all three, depending on time and place. And yes, the answer is often all of the above, which is history's favorite way to ruin a neat thesis. You let your shoulders sink. The fan hum is steady. You can feel yourself entering that sleepy zone where your mind can hold complexity without fighting it. That's the right zone for this, because the next part is easy to oversimplify. On solid ground, the evidence we do have points to border making as a slow process. Forts appear, trade routes get regulated, tax systems expand, local elites adapt, new administrative terms replace old ones, maps update sometimes late, sometimes early, depending on who prints them. Most historians agree that as states become more centralized, the names they use become more standardized, and those names tend to spread through international diplomacy and scholarship. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you imagine yourself standing near a frontier fort in winter. Snow crunches, the air smells of smoke and resin. A guard shifts weight, bored. A clerk inside warms hands over a stove and writes a report. It's not cinematic, it's procedural. But procedure is how borders become reality. Here comes your quirky tidbit, placed gently like a stamp on a page. A huge amount of empire building is paperwork. One interpretation is that what truly erases old labels is often not destruction, but filing. A place is recorded under a new administrative name. That name enters reports. Reports inform maps. Maps inform textbooks. And suddenly, the old label is gone from common usage, not because anyone theatrically scrubbed it, but because everyone quietly stopped using it. Your first light joke arrives with a sleepy grin. You realize history isn't written by the victors so much as it's written by the people who had the most organized folders. The real superpower is a functional archive. Now, Tartaria theories often claim that this border-making phase was part of the cover-up Russia and China expanded, and in doing so, erased Tartaria. A popular rumor claims that Tartaria was a coherent empire that got absorbed and then renamed out of existence by expanding states. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it blends two things: a real historical process, state expansion and renaming, and an imagined conclusion, a single unified Tartarian empire everywhere. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we separate the parts. It's possible that expanding empires absorbed various polities and communities across the regions Europeans labeled Tartary. That's mainstream and well within what historians study. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is that there was one unified Tartarian state across the full mapped region that then got absorbed as a single entity. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartary was never a single political unit. It was a European umbrella term. As Russia and Qing China standardized their own administrative terms and borders, European mapmakers and writers increasingly used those terms because they seemed more precise, more official, more aligned with the world of treaties and diplomacy. Historians still argue whether the increasing specificity of European maps in the 18th and 19th centuries reflects purely improved knowledge or also reflects the growing influence of imperial power structures that determined which names became standard internationally. Again, both can be true. Knowledge and power often travel together. You look down at the atlas and notice how the modern mind wants to interpret disappearance as death. But words can disappear without the thing itself dying. A label can vanish while people remain, while cultures remain, while histories continue just under other names. Now the misty part offered gently. A fringe idea proposes that the speed of border making and administrative renaming suggests a deliberate attempt to hide something older and grander. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence here often relies on inference. The label disappeared, therefore they hid it. But disappearance can also mean replacement. It can mean modernization. It can mean the slow triumph of bureaucratic language. Your second light joke arrives as you picture a border being decided not by swords, but by a meeting. Someone yawns. Someone spills tea. Someone says, "Let's just draw it along the river," and then a river becomes destiny. Honestly, that's the most terrifying and comforting thing about borders. They're sometimes decided by people who also forget where they put their keys. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the erasure people sense is the way modern state borders harden a world that used to be more fluid? The steppe corridor doesn't like hard lines. Trade routes don't care. Seasonal movement doesn't care. But states care. States love lines. Lines are how you tax. Lines are how you control. Lines are how you define inside and outside. One interpretation is that Tartaria is a ghost of that earlier fluidity, a broad term for a region Europeans struggled to subdivide. When modern borders and names take over, the ghost feels erased, when in fact it's simply been replaced by a different way of organizing space. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You let your eyes blur slightly, just enough that the printed borderlines soften. The map becomes less like a set of walls and more like a set of suggestions. And you can almost hear the steppe wind again, brushing over all the lines, as if to say nice drawings. Anyway, you breathe slowly. The fan hum continues. You turn the page again, ready for the next question. If Tartaria is such a compelling myth today, what keeps it alive in the modern imagination? And why does it feel so personally satisfying to so many people? The map lines soften in your mind, and for a moment you let yourself enjoy the simple fact that you don't have to solve anything tonight. You only have to follow the question the way you follow a slow river, not demanding it become a straight line, just watching where it bends. Because now you're at the part of the story that isn't really about Tartary or Tartaria at all. It's about you, about modern life, about the way your brain handles uncertainty when it's tired, and the way an elegant theory can feel like a warm blanket pulled up to your chin. Most historians agree that historical myths don't survive solely because people are gullible. What's broadly accepted is that myths survive because they do something useful. They explain complexity. They give emotional closure. They offer a villain or a hero. They restore a sense of meaning. Archaeology suggests that humans have always built stories around fragments, ruins, artifacts, oral traditions, because a fragment begs for a whole. The evidence we do have points to a long human habit. We hate an unfinished narrative. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories thrive because they convert scattered curiosities into one coherent plot. A more cautious explanation could be that the theory functions like a modern folktale shaped by the internet's speed, visual culture, and distrust of institutions. Historians still argue whether the current popularity of alternative history narratives is best understood as a reaction to genuine gaps in public education, as a symptom of broader social mistrust, or as a natural outcome of algorithm-driven media that rewards dramatic claims. And yes, if you've ever watched a calm, nuanced video get ignored while a sensational one goes viral, you already know the answer leans toward all of the above. You sink a little deeper into your pillow. The fan hum is steady. The room is dim. And you imagine the internet itself as a giant candlelit map room, except instead of one atlas, there are millions of images, and instead of careful librarians, there are captions written by strangers at 2 a.m. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the Tartaria idea is built from real ingredients. Old maps really do use Tartary. Cities really do have layered streets. Buildings really are grand, and sometimes confusing. Names really do change. Records really do get lost. And modern people really do feel like some parts of history are undertaught or oversimplified, especially histories outside the familiar Western narrative. One interpretation is that Tartaria theories are a protest against that simplification. A more cautious explanation could be that they're also a shortcut, a way to avoid learning many complex histories by replacing them with one dramatic story. Here comes your quirky tidbit tucked in like a little wink. The human brain loves pattern recognition so much it will find patterns in clouds, in toast, in the way two pigeons walk in sync. One interpretation is that Tartaria content feeds that pattern hunger by presenting visually similar buildings and saying, "See?" and your brain, exhausted and delighted, says, "Yes, I see," even when what it sees is a curated pattern, not the full, messy dataset. Your first light joke arrives. You realize the true superpower of the internet isn't misinformation. It's the ability to make you believe your toaster is trying to communicate with you. And if your toaster ever starts printing old maps, please take a nap immediately. Now, Tartaria stories often carry a particular kind of emotional promise. They imply that history has a hidden symmetry. One big empire, one big cover-up, one big reveal. That promise is comforting because it makes the world feel readable. It makes confusion feel temporary. It tells you there's an answer if you just look hard enough. A fringe idea proposes that the popularity of Tartaria is itself evidence that something is being hidden. Why else would so many people sense it? This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's a common reasoning pattern: popularity equals truth. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can examine it gently. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is that collective suspicion necessarily points to a single, hidden fact. Sometimes it points to collective frustration, collective curiosity, or collective mistrust. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartaria is a perfect internet narrative because it's modular. You can plug in a map, you can plug in a building, you can plug in a basement window, you can plug in a mud flood photo, you can plug in a claim about free energy. Each piece feels like evidence, even if the pieces come from different places, different dates, and different contexts. The quilt feels convincing because it's stitched tightly, not because each fabric square is historically connected. Historians still argue whether modern alternative history communities are best understood as grassroots historical inquiry as entertainment and storytelling, or as a mix that shifts depending on the creator and audience. And the honest answer is it's a mix. Some people are genuinely curious, some people want a good story, some people want to feel smarter than institutions. Some people want to feel less powerless in a complicated world. Your second light joke arrives as you picture someone triumphantly saying, "I did my own research," and the research is a screenshot of a screenshot of a screenshot, which is not nothing. It's just not the same as slow study. Still, the phrase has become a kind of spell. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if Tartaria isn't a literal empire, erased, but a symbol of modern longing? Longing for coherence, longing for a hidden order, longing for a world where the past contains a grand secret that makes the present make sense. One interpretation is that the theory is less about the 1700s and more about the 2020s, about how it feels to live in a world saturated with information and still feel unsure what to trust. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You imagine a person alone at night, scrolling through images of old buildings and maps, feeling that familiar mix of wonder and suspicion. That person is you, in a sense, and you realize something gentle curiosity is not a problem. Curiosity is beautiful. The only risk is when curiosity turns into certainty too quickly. So you practice a calmer kind of curiosity. When you see a claim, you ask, what's broadly accepted here? What's interpretation? What's imagined? You let those categories sit side by side without fighting. You allow the mystery to remain a mystery. Your third light joke arrives softly. You decide the best historical mindset is the same as the best bedtime mindset. If your brain starts arguing loudly, you just tell it, "Not tonight, buddy," and then you tuck it in. You rest your hand on the atlas one last time and feel the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a reminder. The past is heavy because it's full of people, and people are never simple. And as your eyes begin to feel heavier too, you sense the story moving toward its last task. Not to reveal a hidden empire, but to sort what's solid from what's missed, and to let you fall asleep with a question instead of a verdict. You don't need to turn another page now. You can feel the story arriving at its soft edge, the place where the map room's candlelight dims and the fan hum becomes the main soundtrack again. The atlas is still there, heavy and quiet, but your mind is calmer than when you started. The label, Tartary, no longer feels like a locked door. It feels like an old sign on a road that has been rerouted. Most historians agree that Tartary and Tartaria appear in many early modern European maps as broad terms for vast regions of northern and inner Asia, and that these terms do not automatically represent a single unified empire. What's broadly accepted is that Eurasia's history in the areas once labeled this way includes many powerful states, confederations and empires, some famous, some undertaught, woven together through trade routes, migrations and shifting borders. The evidence we do have points to real processes that can make a big label fade, improving geographic knowledge, changing scholarly conventions, expanding state administrations, and the standardizing force of treaties and bureaucratic categories. One interpretation is that the modern Tartaria narrative is a dramatic rereading of those real processes turning label drift into erasure. A more cautious explanation could be that the disappearance of the term from mainstream maps reflects changing habits of naming rather than a coordinated global deletion. Historians still argue whether the fading of older umbrella terms like Tartary is best explained primarily by improved cartographic precision, or by political power deciding which names become standard internationally, or by both forces working together. And that is the most realistic kind of debate, because history is usually a braided rope knowledge power and fashion all pulling at once. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you hold those categories like 3 small stones in your palm. The documented stone is smooth and simple. Early modern maps often used broad labels for regions Europeans didn't subdivide well, and those labels changed as knowledge and politics changed. The interpreted stone has a little texture. It's reasonable to see Tartary as an umbrella term shaped by European perception, and to see its disappearance as a shift toward more specific naming tied to modern state borders. The imagined stone is the one that glows in the dark, just a little. What if there really was not a single hidden empire, but a lost sense of coherence, an older world where the steppe corridor felt like one continuous breathing space, and where outsiders labeled it with one big word because the space itself resisted neat partition. A fringe idea proposes that Tartaria was the greatest empire erased from human history, a hidden civilization with advanced technology and infrastructure deliberately scrubbed from records. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers the comfort of a grand reveal. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And for a single unified global Tartarian empire, as popularly described online, the evidence tends to be thin and interpretive, relying on patterns that can have other explanations. To be clear, this is debated, and that's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that Tartaria stories gather real fragments, old map labels, layered city streets, grand architecture, rapid modernization, lost records, and stitch them into one neat narrative, because neat narratives help people feel less lost. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we can't confirm is that all these fragments point to one hidden empire, rather than to the ordinary fascinating mess of human history. Here comes your quirky tidbit, a last little coin to slip into your pocket before sleep. Sometimes the most mysterious thing about a historical label is that it was never meant to satisfy modern curiosity. One interpretation is that Tartary was useful shorthand for a printer in Amsterdam or London, not a sacred truth about the world. And the fact that it now fuels modern mythology is almost poetic. It's like finding an old grocery list and deciding it's a prophecy. Your first light joke arrives quiet and friendly. You imagine a cartographer from 1700 looking over your shoulder and saying, "Wait, you thought I meant a secret empire?" "No, friend. I meant stuff over there." And then he calmly goes back to drawing a sea monster because priorities. You let the laughter fade into softness. You don't need to win the debate. You don't need to settle the entire internet tonight. You only need to end with a way of thinking that keeps your curiosity alive without turning it into certainty. So you build yourself a gentle rule like a bedtime ritual. When you see a claim, you ask what's broadly accepted. Then you ask what's interpretation. Then you ask what's imagined. You let each part exist without pretending it's the whole. When you see a map label, you remember that maps are arguments, not mirrors. When you see a building, you remember that architecture is layered, renovated, and influenced, not always a single origin story. When you see a basement window, you remember that cities raise streets, rebuild after disasters, and stack their lives like blankets. When you feel the itch of erasure, you remember that names change, archives fail, and education simplifies, not always maliciously often, just because humans are tired. Historians still argue whether the deepest driver of Tartaria's modern popularity is a genuine historical gap or a modern emotional need for coherence, or the internet's reward system for dramatic narratives, or all of it intertwined. And the fact that scholars can debate that without shouting is your reminder that uncertainty doesn't have to be scary. It can be calm. It can be a soft room where questions rest. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the greatest empire isn't a hidden kingdom at all, but the empire of your own imagination, the way your mind can build palaces out of fragments and shadows? And what if the healthiest thing you can do is enjoy that imagination without letting it harden into a verdict? Now the pacing slows like footsteps turning into a glide. You can feel your breathing deepen. The fan hum becomes steady and distant like wind over grass. The candlelight in your mind dims until it's only a warm smear of gold at the edge of the room. The atlas closes gently, not with a slam, but with a soft, satisfied thump, like a book that knows it has done its job. And in the quiet that follows you, picture the wide steppe again, not as a blank space on a map, not as a secret empire, but as a living landscape that has carried people, horses, languages, and stories for centuries. You picture rivers that keep moving, whether anyone labels them or not. You picture markets at crossroads, the smell of bread and smoke, the low murmur of voices. You picture a clerk stamping a document, not erasing history, just filing it into a new name. Your thoughts become longer and softer, like sentences that don't need to end sharply. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and you feel how gentle that is, how it removes the pressure to be certain. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You don't have to choose only one. You can let the solid ground hold you. You can let the mist be beautiful without pretending it's stone. And as you drift, you let one last image settle over everything. Light as snow that barely sticks, a hand tracing a word on an old map, and then lifting away, leaving the paper untouched. The world still turning, the night still calm. The question remains, but it no longer demands an answer tonight. It simply rests beside you,